Chapter 1. The Illusion of Speed and the Fracturing of Presence. Think about a young person in your life, someone you love dearly, someone whose imagination used to run wild before the world grew so heavy and fast. For me, it was my young nephew. When he was just a little boy, he developed an intense, all-consuming fascination with the legends of a great historical warrior king. He would swing a wooden sword around the courtyard, completely absorbed in the epic battles of the past, demanding to know every detail about the king's life, his triumphs, and the magnificent sandstone palace he built on a high hill. In a quiet moment of bonding, I promised this young boy that one day, when he was older, I would take him across the country to see that very palace with his own eyes. It was a promise I intended to keep, but as the years slipped by, I forgot about it. By the time I remembered, a decade had passed. My nephew had grown into a young man, but he was entirely lost. He had dropped out of his studies, and he spent almost all his waking hours enclosed in his room, bathed in the blue glow of his phone, swiping endlessly through a blur of social media feeds and streaming videos. He seemed to be vibrating at a frantic, uncatchable frequency, completely unable to hold a conversation for more than a few minutes before his eyes darted back to his screen. Hoping to break this tragic spell, I reminded him of my old promise, and I offered to take him on that long journey across the plains to the ancient fortress, on one strict condition. We had to leave our devices switched off. We had to return to reality. When we finally arrived at the towering gates of the palace, we had traveled hundreds of kilometers. But the experience was nothing like the romantic vision I had held in my head. Instead of a knowledgeable local guide walking us through the echoing halls, we were handed digital audio tablets and earpieces, instructed to follow a glowing blue dot on a screen. We wandered through the breathtaking architecture, surrounded by a sea of other tourists, all of them shuffling forward with blank expressions, their heads bowed toward their devices. In the grandest courtyard of the palace, a place of staggering architectural beauty, I watched a middle-aged couple completely ignore the intricate stone carvings right in front of them. Instead, the man excitedly showed his wife how they could use the augmented reality app on their tablet to swipe left and swipe right to see a digital rendering of the very room they were currently standing inside. I felt a sudden volcanic surge of anger. I wanted to yell at them to look up, to turn their heads, to experience the raw, unmediated beauty of the physical world. I turned to share this profound frustration with my nephew, only to find him lingering in the shadows of an archway, his phone hidden beneath his jacket, frantically scrolling through his messages. He had broken his promise. He was entirely disconnected from the present moment. As I sat alone later that evening, sipping a hot cup of chai and listening to the distant hum of the bustling bazaar, the anger drained out of me, leaving only a hollow sense of dread. I realized that my furious reaction to my nephew and to the strangers in the palace was actually a projection of my own deep-seated terror. I was angry because I recognized that I was fracturing in the exact same way. I too was losing my ability to be present. I too was living my life through a glass screen, constantly twitching toward my pocket at the slightest vibration, unable to sit in silence or read a complex book without feeling an unbearable itch to check my notifications. I decided I had to escape. I traveled to a pristine, high-altitude glacial lake in the mountains, a place renowned for its absolute snow-draped tranquility. But even there, waist-deep in freezing crystalline water, I was surrounded by tourists clutching waterproof smartphone cases on selfie sticks, loudly live-streaming their supposedly peaceful retreat to thousands of strangers on the internet. There was no escape. The environment itself had fundamentally changed, and our minds were changing right along with it. For a long time, we have told ourselves a comforting lie about this loss of focus. We tell ourselves that our inability to concentrate is simply a personal failing, a lack of individual discipline, or just the natural, inevitable consequence of getting older. But if you look at the hidden architecture of how information moves through our society, a much darker and more systemic truth emerges. Imagine standing in the middle of a serene village where news used to arrive just once a day in the form of a printed morning paper. You could sit, read it slowly, digest the events of the world, and then go about your daily labor with a clear head. Today we are standing at the bottom of a roaring high-pressure waterfall of data. We are drinking from a fire hose, Mathematical models tracking the rise and fall of cultural topics over the last century have proven definitively that our collective attention spans are in a state of rapid, measurable decline. Because there is simply so much more information being pumped into the system, the amount of time we can collectively focus on any single issue has drastically shrunk. A topic flares into the public consciousness, reaches a fever pitch of popularity, and then vanishes into obscurity at an accelerating, dizzying speed. We desperately try to cope with this overwhelming velocity by attempting to do everything at once. We have embraced the myth of the ultimate juggler. We believe that we can smoothly transition between answering an urgent work email, monitoring a breaking news alert, holding a conversation with a loved one, and planning our financial future, all in the exact same breath. But the human brain is not a machine with dual processors. It is a deeply organic, profoundly human organ that evolved to hold only one or two conscious thoughts at any given moment. When we believe we are gracefully multitasking, we are actually engaging in a frantic, exhausting psychological sprint, switching our attention rapidly back and forth between distinct tasks. Think about what happens when you sit down to calculate something complex, like your annual tax deductions. You have to hold multiple numbers, rules, and scenarios in your mind simultaneously. Suddenly, your phone vibrates with a text message. You glance away for just 3 seconds to read it, and then you look back at your paperwork. In that tiny fraction of a second, your brain must completely unspool the mental architecture required to read the text, and then desperately attempt to rebuild the complex web of financial logic it was holding just moments before. This invisible friction is known as the switch cost effect, and its consequences are devastating. It drains your cognitive energy, ensuring that you work slower, make significantly more mistakes, and lose the mental bandwidth required for genuine creativity. Persistent technological distraction degrades your immediate cognitive performance as severely as losing a full night of sleep or attempting to work while intoxicated. We are sacrificing the profound depth of human thought for the shallow illusion of speed. Our minds are equipped with a natural filtering mechanism. Think of it as a seasoned gatekeeper standing at the entrance of a bustling, chaotic marketplace. The gatekeeper's sole job is to block out the overwhelming noise, the shouting vendors, and the clattering carts, allowing you to focus your energy entirely on the one merchant you are trying to speak with. In a healthy environment, this gatekeeper is strong and capable. But today we live in a culture that subjects this mental gatekeeper to an unprecedented, relentless siege. It is forced to fight off a continuous barrage of digital pings, physical exhaustion, emotional anxieties, and a culture that demands we process an inhuman volume of data at all times. The gatekeeper is completely overwhelmed, and as a result, the chaotic noise of the world floods directly into our minds, washing away our ability to concentrate on the things that truly matter. To reclaim our presence, we must first stop blaming ourselves for failing to run at the speed of a machine, and begin to understand the invisible forces that are pushing our deeply human minds beyond their breaking point. Chapter 2: The Death of Deep Rest and the Loss of Flow. Picture a typical morning in your life. The ceiling fan is whirring overhead, attempting to push the heavy, humid air around the room, and the sun has barely crested the horizon. Yet the alarm on your device has already shattered the quiet. You drag yourself out of bed, your limbs feeling as though they are filled with wet sand, and you immediately reach for a cup of heavily brewed scalding tea or strong coffee just to shock your nervous system into functioning. You are utterly exhausted before the day has even truly begun. This is not an isolated incident. It is the chronic, grinding reality for millions of us. We have constructed a society where we are perpetually fighting our own biology, squeezing our natural sun-driven rhythms into the relentless artificial demands of a constantly active economy. We have been taught to treat sleep as a frustrating inconvenience, an irritating obstacle standing between us and our productivity, something to be wrestled with, minimized, and ultimately conquered. We operate under the profound misconception that sleep is simply a passive void, a blank period where the body powers down like a machine being unplugged from the wall. But deep within the quiet, vulnerable hours of the night, your brain is engaged in an incredibly active and vital process of restoration. Throughout your waking hours, metabolic waste, a toxic cellular debris, builds up inside your head. When you finally surrender to sleep, physical channels within your brain literally open up, allowing a watery fluid to wash through the tissue and flush out these toxic byproducts. Without this essential nightly cleansing, your cognitive pathways become physically clogged, leaving you with that heavy, sluggish sensation that mimics a severe hangover, even if you have not consumed a single drop of alcohol. Furthermore, it is only during sleep that your mind can actively process the chaotic events of the day, weaving new, fragile information into your long-term memory and utilizing the theater of dreams to emotionally untangle the psychological stresses you have encountered. By cutting our sleep short to stare at glowing screens, we are severely damaging our memory, destroying our emotional resilience, and completely dismantling our ability to draw creative connections. The consequences of this chronic, society-wide sleep deprivation manifest in terrifying, invisible ways. When you force yourself to stay awake and push through the fog of exhaustion, your brain begins to rebel to protect itself. You might be sitting in a fluorescent-lit office, the hum of the air conditioner droning in your ears as you stare intently at a complex spreadsheet on your monitor. Your eyes are wide open, your hands are on the keyboard, and you believe you are actively working. But beneath the surface, exhausted portions of your brain are actually plunging into brief, localized moments of unconsciousness. This phenomenon, known as local sleep, means that you can be entirely unaware that your cognitive abilities have partially shut down, severely compromising your attention, your reaction time, and your judgment. We attempt to mask this dangerous exhaustion with artificial fixes, pouring caffeine into our bloodstreams to manually block the brain's natural chemical signals that beg for rest, a trick that provides no actual energy and only ensures a much harder, more devastating crash later in the day. When the anxiety of our wired, sleepless lives becomes too much to bear, we turn to chemical sedatives and sleeping pills, knocking ourselves unconscious without ever achieving the active, restorative phases of genuine sleep. Our environment is flooded with the artificial blue light of screens that trick our primeval brains into believing it is always the bright peak of midday, keeping us in a state of perpetual, anxious alertness. We are sacrificing our most essential biological rest to feed an economic engine that demands our constant consumption and our unbroken attention. This profound systemic exhaustion leaves us deeply vulnerable, stripping away our cognitive defenses and making it nearly impossible to access the most beautiful, fulfilling state of the human mind. Think about how a trainer can condition a caged animal, a bird or a rat, to perform meaningless, repetitive actions simply by offering it a tiny, unpredictable reward, like a single pellet of food. By exploiting the animal's most basic biological urges, the trainer can completely hijack its focus, forcing it to press a lever over and over again in a desperate loop. Our modern digital environments have been meticulously designed using these exact same principles of behavioral manipulation. Because we are too tired to resist, we are easily conditioned to endlessly pull down our screens, waiting for the unpredictable reward of a digital heart, a message, or a piece of viral outrage. We trade the vast, rich potential of our minds for the hollow, fleeting validation of a digital pellet, acting more like trained subjects in a laboratory than free human beings. But there is a powerful, deeply human alternative to this cycle of exhaustion and manipulation. Decades ago, researchers studying the psychology of human joy observed artists, athletes, and musicians who engaged in incredibly difficult, demanding tasks for hours on end without any promise of money, fame, or external reward. Think of a musician sitting cross-legged on the floor, the heavy evening heat pressing in from the bustling street outside, tuning a stringed instrument. At first, there is a conscious effort, a mechanical adjustment of pegs, and a deliberate placing of fingers. But as the melody takes shape, something miraculous happens. The noise of the traffic fades, the worries of the day evaporate. The musician is no longer playing the instrument, they become the music itself. 10 minutes stretch into 3 hours, yet it feels like a single suspended breath. These individuals described entering a state of absolute absorption, a mental space where their sense of ego dissolved, time vanished entirely, and they felt perfectly merged with the activity. This profound state of deep focus is known as flow. It is the most exquisite form of human attention, a sensation that feels utterly effortless even when you are exerting yourself to your absolute limits. Unlike the frantic, fragmented distraction of our screen-bound lives, a flow state nourishes the mind and leaves you feeling deeply fulfilled, anchored, and alive. To achieve this vital state, you cannot simply wait for it to wash over you, nor can you find it by passively scrolling on a sofa. Flow requires you to deliberately construct the right psychological conditions. First, you must choose one single, clearly defined goal, ruthlessly pushing aside the temptation to multitask, because attempting to do two things at once instantly shatters the fragile potential for flow. Second, the task must hold genuine, intrinsic meaning for you, because the human brain evolved to naturally focus only on things that possess true significance to our survival or our soul. Finally, the challenge before you must sit right at the precipice of your current abilities. If it is too easy, your mind will slip into autopilot and apathy, but if it is too difficult, you will be overwhelmed by frustration and anxiety. When you find that perfect, delicate balance, you unlock a wellspring of sustained, joyful concentration. We are currently living in a society that systematically starves us of both deep rest and deep focus. We cannot possibly expect to access the soaring heights of a flow state if our brains are clogged with the toxic residue of chronic exhaustion. To reclaim our minds, we must recognize that resting our bodies and immersing our attention deeply into a single, meaningful pursuit are not indulgent luxuries. They are the fundamental requirements of a functioning, healthy, and meaningful human life. Chapter 3. The Disappearance of the Deep Mind. Imagine stepping off a bustling, sun-baked street and ducking into a beautifully chaotic second-hand bookstore. You know the kind of place. The air is thick with the comforting, slightly sweet scent of decaying paper and binding glue, and the shelves are stacked so haphazardly they look like they might collapse under the weight of thousands of unread stories. I used to visit a shop just like this, and I would frequently chat with the young woman who worked behind the counter. She was brilliantly smart, surrounded all day by the greatest literature ever written, and she always seemed to have a different classic novel resting open next to the cash register. One afternoon, I complimented her on how incredibly fast she managed to read through so many thick, complex books. She looked at me with a sad, almost embarrassed smile, and confessed that she actually wasn't reading them at all. She told me she could only ever get through the first chapter or two before her focus simply evaporated. Here was a bright, curious mind, swimming in an ocean of literature, completely unable to sustain the attention required to sink beneath the surface. Her cognitive engine would simply sputter and stall. This heartbreaking admission is not an anomaly. It is the silent, shared reality of our modern era. The deep, immersive experience of reading for pleasure is in a state of catastrophic freefall. Across the globe, the proportion of adults who regularly sit down to read a book has plummeted to historically low levels, with complex literary fiction suffering the most brutal decline. For many of us, getting lost in a book used to be the most accessible, reliable form of deep focus in our lives, a quiet sanctuary where we could dedicate hours to a single narrative. But as we have migrated our lives onto glowing screens, we have not merely changed the medium through which we consume words, we have fundamentally rewired the physical mechanics of how we read. When we hold a physical book, we train our minds to follow a linear, sustained path, patiently absorbing information sentence by sentence. But when we look at a screen, we engage in a manic, hyperactive behavior known as skimming and scanning. We dart our eyes across the digital page, hunting for bullet points, bolded words, and the absolute minimum amount of information required to extract the core message before immediately jumping to the next tab. The tragedy is that this frantic, extractive style of reading does not stay confined to our devices. It bleeds over into every other aspect of our lives. When we try to sit down with a physical book, our brains default to the manic skipping and jumping we have practiced online, rendering us entirely unable to settle into a state of cognitive patience. Exhaustive scientific studies have proven that when we read complex information on a screen, we understand and remember significantly less of it than if we had read the exact same words on a physical page, a phenomenon researchers call screen inferiority. We are trading the profound depth of genuine comprehension for a shallow, frantic illusion of knowledge. To understand what we are losing, we have to look closely at the invisible messages embedded within the technologies we use. When a new medium arrives in our society, It acts like a pair of tinted goggles, subtly altering the way we perceive the entire world. Before you even process the specific content of a social media post, the platform itself is whispering a philosophy into your ear. It tells you that the world is simple and can be fully explained in a few short, explosive characters. It tells you that immediate reactions are far more valuable than careful deliberation. Most dangerously, it tells you that a statement's worth is entirely determined by how quickly and loudly it is applauded by a crowd. When you sit down with a physical book, however, the medium offers a radically different philosophy. It gently reminds you that the world is immensely complex and that true understanding requires setting aside significant time to think deeply. It tells you there is profound value in narrowing your focus to a single voice, page after page. Most importantly, it reminds you that other human beings have vast, intricate inner lives just as rich and complicated as your own. This is why reading, particularly reading fiction, acts as an empathy gym for the human mind. When you read a novel, your brain is performing a magnificent, highly complex simulation. You are directing a tremendous amount of focus outward to decode the symbols on the page, while simultaneously directing your attention inward to simulate the emotions, motivations, and hidden desires of the characters. You are practicing the art of stepping inside another person's consciousness. Psychological studies have consistently shown that the more you engage with deep, narrative fiction, the better you become at reading the subtle emotional cues of real human beings in the physical world. By abandoning the sustained narrative of books for the disconnected, shrieking fragments of social media, we are allowing the muscles of human empathy to atrophy and wither. We are losing the capacity to understand one another. But the collapse of sustained reading is only half of this cognitive tragedy. There is another, equally vital form of attention that is being systematically eradicated from our daily lives. For over a century, we have operated under the assumption that attention acts exactly like a theatrical spotlight. We believe that to focus, we must shine a fierce, singular beam of mental energy directly onto the task at hand, illuminating it while everything else falls into darkness. From a very young age, we are scolded for letting that spotlight drift. We are told that staring out a classroom window, daydreaming, or letting our minds wander is a lazy, unproductive waste of time. Yet when neuroscientists actually peer inside the living human brain, they discover something miraculous. When you finally turn off that harsh spotlight of focus and let your mind float aimlessly, your brain does not power down or go dormant. Instead, a massive, highly active neural network roars to life. This wandering state is not a failure of attention. It is an entirely different, incredibly necessary form of attention. Think of a brilliant structural engineer tasked with repairing an ancient, crumbling stone bridge. For weeks, he sits at his desk, shining the intense spotlight of his focus onto the blueprints, crunching numbers, calculating load-bearing weights, and feeling increasingly frustrated because the math simply will not work. He is completely blocked. Defeated, he decides to take a long train ride out into the countryside. He leaves his blueprints behind, turns off his phone, and simply stares out the window at the endless, swaying fields of yellow mustard flowers. His mind detaches. He thinks randomly about his childhood, about the rhythmic clacking of the train tracks, about the way the light catches the dust in the carriage. And then, entirely out of nowhere, the solution to the bridge's structural flaw strikes him like a bolt of lightning. This flash of insight is not magic. It is the direct result of a wandering mind doing its crucial, behind-the-scenes work. When we allow our minds to roam, they are quietly attempting to make sense of the world, drawing our fragmented experiences together into a cohesive understanding of our lives. A wandering mind is forging entirely new, unexpected connections between ideas that were previously separated, which is the literal biological mechanism of human creativity. Furthermore, mind-wandering allows us to engage in mental time travel, projecting ourselves into the future to run psychological simulations of upcoming challenges so we can prepare for them emotionally. Without this free-floating cognitive space, our ability to generate original ideas, organize our long-term goals, and patiently process reality collapses. So why do we fight it so fiercely? Why do we reflexively reach into our pockets to summon a digital distraction the absolute second we are forced to wait in a line, sit on a bus, or simply be alone with our own thoughts? The answer is rooted in the overwhelming stress of modern life. When you feel physically and psychologically safe, mind-wandering is a beautiful, restorative gift. But if you live in a state of high anxiety, crushing financial pressure, or relentless speed, a wandering mind quickly descends into dark, obsessive rumination. In a highly stressful environment, letting your mind drift means inviting in a flood of terrifying anxieties about the future and bitter regrets about the past. We dive into our screens not because we genuinely care about the superficial content scrolling past our eyes, but because we are desperately seeking an anesthetic to numb the discomfort of our own wandering minds. We have cornered ourselves. We are too exhausted to sustain the deep, empathetic focus required to read a book, and we are too stressed to endure the creative, sense-making wandering of our own unaccompanied thoughts. We are trapped in a shallow, agitated middle ground, skimming the chaotic surface of reality while the vast, rich depths of our own minds remain entirely unexplored. If we want to think, to create, and to genuinely understand the people around us, we must learn to push away the noise, embrace the quiet, and summon the courage to dive back into the deep. Chapter 4. The Machine Built to Steal Your Focus. Imagine a crowded, dust-swirled marketplace on a sweltering afternoon. The air thick with the smell of roasting spices and the chaotic symphony of haggling vendors. In the center of the square, a street magician has gathered a small crowd. He holds up a polished silver coin, turns his hand over, and in a flash of movement, the coin completely vanishes. The crowd gasps, clapping in delight. But how did he do it? The coin did not actually dematerialize. The magician succeeded because he fundamentally understands something that most of us refuse to admit. Human attention has severe, predictable limitations, and if you know exactly where those blind spots are, you can exploit them. Magic is not the study of supernatural forces. It is the rigorous study of human psychological vulnerabilities. The magician knows that if he directs your gaze to his left hand with a sudden movement, you will be completely blind to what his right hand is doing. You believe you are in total control of your own focus, watching his every move with your own free will, but in reality, your attention has been effortlessly hijacked and guided precisely where he wanted it to go. Now, scale that street corner illusion up to a global level. Imagine tens of thousands of the most brilliant engineers, data scientists, and behavioral psychologists sitting in heavily air-conditioned, glass-walled tech parks, staring at vast dashboards of user metrics. Their entire professional existence is dedicated to performing this exact same sleight of hand on a population of billions. These brilliant minds study decades of psychological research, learning how to condition human behavior just as a scientist might condition an animal in a laboratory to press a lever for a pellet of food. They are not building these digital environments to empower you. They are meticulously engineering them to bypass your conscious decision-making and hack your deepest psychological vulnerabilities. You believe you are simply checking your phone out of your own autonomous desire, but you are actually responding to a perfectly calibrated system designed to grab your focus and never, ever let it go. To understand why this is happening, we must bravely face the financial reality of the digital world we inhabit. We seamlessly use search engines, messaging apps, and social networks without ever paying a single rupee in subscription fees. We have convinced ourselves that these magnificent world-spanning services are somehow free. But a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure is not maintained out of charity. If you are not paying for the product, you are the product. The true business model of these digital empires is to harvest your attention and sell it to the highest bidder. Every time you linger on a photograph, every time you type a query into a search bar, every time you hesitate before scrolling past an article, your behavior is being meticulously tracked, recorded, and analyzed. These corporations use this staggering mountain of intimate data to construct a highly accurate, invisible digital replica of your psyche on their servers. Think of it as a digital shadow built from your online habits, your geographic locations, your late-night anxieties, and your political leanings. They run millions of algorithmic tests against this shadow profile to discover exactly what triggers your emotions, what makes you click, and what keeps you staring at the glass. They then sell this unparalleled predictive power to advertisers, political campaigns, and anyone else willing to pay to manipulate your behavior. Your ability to focus on your own life is literally the fuel that powers their profit margins. If a social network were redesigned to help you quickly find a local event, connect with a friend, and immediately put your phone away to live in the real world, the company's share price would instantly collapse. Their ultimate financial imperative is not to enhance your life, but to maximize your screen time. Because they are trapped in this relentless pursuit of engagement, these engineers deliberately design features that eradicate our natural stopping cues. Think about reading a physical newspaper or a chapter in a book. Eventually, you reach the end of the page, and you must make an active, conscious decision to turn it. That brief pause allows your brain to ask, "Do I want to keep doing this?" But the digital world has stripped that pause away. The invention of the endless, bottomless feed ensures that the moment you near the bottom of your screen, more content automatically loads, infinitely replenishing itself. This design choice is engineered to bypass your brain's natural impulse control, locking you into a hypnotic state of perpetual scrolling. You lose hours of your life not because you lacked willpower, but because a team of designers intentionally removed the brakes from the vehicle you were driving. But the most devastating consequence of this business model is what it does to our emotions and our shared reality. An algorithm has no moral compass. It does not care if a piece of information is true, uplifting, or beautiful. It only cares if the information keeps you engaged. Unfortunately, human beings are hardwired with a psychological quirk known as negativity bias. We are biologically programmed to pay far more attention to threats, anger, and outrage than we are to joy or nuance, because spotting danger kept our ancestors alive. The algorithms quickly learned that feeding us calm, factual information causes us to put our phones down, while feeding us extreme, anger-inducing content keeps our eyes glued to the screen. Imagine a kindly older relative who enjoys watching mildly conservative political debates online. The recommendation engine registers his interest. But to keep him watching longer, it doesn't offer him more of the same mild content. It slowly begins recommending slightly more aggressive videos, then intensely polarized ones, and finally, full-blown radicalized conspiracy theories. It pulls him down a dark, terrifying rabbit hole, not because the algorithm has a political agenda, but simply because shocking, extreme content is the most efficient way to maximize watch time. Over time, this daily diet of algorithmic outrage rewires his worldview, turning a peaceful citizen into a vessel of hyper-vigilant fury. When this psychological manipulation is applied to entire populations simultaneously, it sets society on fire. Falsehoods, rumors, and sensationalized lies travel exponentially faster and further than the boring, nuanced truth. We find our family chat groups and community forums flooded with terrifying, fabricated stories designed to trigger our deepest fears. Because we are constantly marinating in this artificial hostility, we enter a state of chronic hypervigilance, our brains perpetually scanning for the next impending attack. In this state of manufactured panic, our collective attention span shatters. We lose the ability to sit down together, agree on basic reality, and focus long enough to solve the massive existential challenges facing our world. We are suffering from a multi-front assault on our cognitive liberty. We are trained to crave meaningless digital rewards, forced to rapidly switch tasks until our minds are exhausted, tracked to expose our deepest vulnerabilities, pumped full of artificial outrage, and isolated in a terrifying, fractured reality. But understanding the mechanics of this machine offers us a profound sense of hope. Once you realize that your fractured focus is not a personal failure, but the highly predictable result of a specific corporate business model, the illusion breaks. The technology in our pockets does not inherently have to function this way. The endless scrolling, the manipulative notifications, and the outrage-driven algorithms are choices made by humans to maximize profit. And because they are human choices, they can be unmade, heavily regulated, and fundamentally redesigned to respect, rather than exploit, the beautiful, fragile limits of the human mind. Chapter 5. The Trap of False Solutions. Imagine a devoted father sitting in his living room on a humid evening, listening to the heavy monsoon rains drumming against the window pane. He has promised to spend the evening helping his young daughter with a complex school project, drawing a vibrant map of the world across a large sheet of paper. As she excitedly asks him a question about the painted oceans, his phone vibrates on the table. Without thinking, his hand reaches out. He tells her to wait just 1 second while he checks a crucial work email. One email turns into a quick glance at the news, which bleeds into scrolling through a social media feed. When he finally pulls his eyes away from the glowing screen, he realizes the room is quiet. His daughter has packed up her colored pencils and walked away, her shoulders slumped. In that devastating moment, the father realizes he has just sent his child a silent, heartbreaking message. Whatever is happening inside this little glass rectangle is vastly more important than you. Shaken to his core by this realization, the father resolves to fix himself. He decides he has a terrible addiction, a personal flaw that he must conquer through sheer willpower. He goes online and finds a mountain of advice on how to reclaim his focus. He downloads special applications that block his access to the internet. He sets his phone screen to grayscale to make it less appealing. He reads articles that tell him he must analyze his internal triggers, the fleeting moments of boredom or anxiety that push him to seek digital distraction, and learn to suppress them. For a few days, this strict regimen works. But soon, the crushing demands of his stressful job, the exhaustion of daily life, and the ubiquitous nature of technology wear down his defenses. He slips. He starts scrolling again. And when he fails, he feels an overwhelming sense of guilt and shame. He concludes that he is simply weak, lacking the moral fortitude to control his own mind. This father has unknowingly fallen into a devastating psychological trap, one that is snaring millions of us every single day. Sociologists call this phenomenon cruel optimism. It occurs when society takes a massive, deeply rooted structural crisis and offers you a simplistic, highly individualized solution. On the surface, the advice sounds incredibly empowering and optimistic. It tells you that you are entirely in control and that with just a few clever life hacks and a shift in your mindset, you can instantly solve your problems. But this optimism is profoundly cruel because it completely ignores the overwhelming systemic forces that are actively working against you. When the simplistic solution inevitably fails because it was never designed to withstand the crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar distraction industry, you do not blame the system. You blame yourself. You internalize the failure, believing that your inability to focus is a personal defect rather than the highly predictable outcome of an environment designed to fracture your attention. To truly understand how this trap works, look at how our society has handled physical health over the last few decades. Half a century ago, widespread lifestyle diseases and severe obesity were incredibly rare. But then, our physical environment underwent a radical, toxic transformation. Our local markets and neighborhoods were flooded with highly processed, sugar-laden foods. Our daily routines became increasingly sedentary, and our baseline levels of financial and social stress skyrocketed, driving us to seek comfort in what we consumed. Our bodies simply reacted to this drastically altered environment. But instead of regulating the food industry, redesigning our cities for movement, or addressing the crushing stress of modern labor, society handed us diet books. We were told that gaining weight was a personal moral failing, a shameful lack of self-discipline. We were instructed to meticulously count calories, to practice extreme restraint, and to simply try harder. But the grim reality is that individual diets fail the vast majority of the time, precisely because they demand that you rely on finite willpower while remaining trapped in a toxic environment that is actively pushing you toward failure. A diet does not change the world around you. It merely asks you to fight a lonely, exhausting battle against it. Attempting to solve a systemic environmental crisis through sheer personal restraint is like trying to run up a downward-moving escalator. A few exceptional individuals might sprint to the top, but the vast majority of us will eventually collapse from exhaustion, sliding right back to the bottom while carrying the heavy burden of unwarranted guilt. The exact same cruel optimism is now being weaponized against our minds. The very architects of the digital platforms that steal our focus, the engineers who meticulously designed the endless scroll and the manipulative notification loops are now offering us digital diet advice. They stand on stages and tell us that we just need to manage our internal triggers better. They say that if you feel stressed and reach for your phone, that is your own fault for not managing your emotions. They point out that they have kindly provided a "Do Not Disturb" button on your device and ask why you simply do not possess the discipline to push it. This narrative is a brilliant manipulative deflection. It is the equivalent of a massive industrial factory pumping thick, toxic black smoke into your neighborhood, And when you start coughing, the factory owners hand you a tiny, flimsy paper mask and tell you that you simply need to practice better breathing techniques. They want you to believe that your coughing is a personal failure of lung capacity rather than the direct result of their pollution. When the tech industry tells you that the solution to a fractured mind is just to turn off your notifications, they are placing the entire burden of defense onto your exhausted shoulders. They are asking you to bring a paper shield to a psychological war. You are fighting 1,000 of the smartest engineers on the planet, whose full-time job is to bypass your conscious restraint and hijack your attention, and you are being told that a simple time management schedule will save you. Let me be perfectly clear. Personal responsibility still holds immense value. Taking individual steps to protect your mind is a wonderful, necessary starting point. You absolutely should turn off your non-essential notifications, leave your phone in another room while you sleep, and carve out sacred, screen-free hours to spend with your loved ones. These personal hacks are like eating a healthy vegetable. They are good for you, and they will provide a small measure of relief. But we must be fiercely, unflinchingly honest with ourselves. Individual lifestyle adjustments alone will never be enough to solve a systemic crisis. If we truly want to reclaim our minds, we have to stop punishing ourselves for failing to outsmart supercomputers. We must stop falling into the trap of cruel optimism, constantly berating our own lack of willpower. Instead of internalizing the blame, we must direct our energy outward, recognizing that our attention has been stolen by an environment operating on deeply flawed, extractive incentives. The solution is not to simply retreat into our own private, heavily guarded digital bunkers. The solution requires a profound awakening. We must begin to imagine what it would look like to live in a world where the environment itself is designed to respect, nourish, and elevate the deep, beautiful capabilities of the human mind. Chapter 6. The Age of Hypervigilance. Think about the last time you felt a knot of pure, unadulterated stress pull tight in the center of your chest. Perhaps it was the end of the month and you were sitting at your kitchen table staring at a stack of bills, desperately trying to calculate how a few thousand rupees could possibly stretch to cover the rent, the school fees, and the grocer's tab. Or perhaps you were lying awake at 3 a.m, listening to the rhythmic ticking of a clock, your mind spiraling into a dark vortex of anxieties about your job security or the failing health of a parent. In that moment of suffocating pressure, if someone had placed a complex, deeply profound novel in your hands and asked you to read a chapter, could you have done it? If someone had asked you to sit quietly and paint a picture or engage in a deeply nuanced philosophical debate, would your brain have been capable of participating? Of course not. When human beings are subjected to overwhelming psychological pressure, our ability to engage in slow, deliberate focus simply evaporates. When large groups of people are surveyed and asked to identify the primary reason their attention is fracturing, the majority do not point to their smartphones or the internet. They point directly to the crushing, inescapable weight of their own daily stress. To truly understand how this physiological mechanism destroys our focus, we must look at how the human mind responds to the presence of danger. Imagine a dedicated, compassionate doctor working in a small, underfunded community clinic nestled deep within a densely packed working-class neighborhood. The clinic smells faintly of strong antiseptic and the damp earth of the monsoon season. One afternoon, a deeply exhausted mother walks into the examination room, pulling her young son by the hand. The boy is perpetually in motion. He cannot sit still in his chair. His eyes dart frantically around the room, and his teachers have sent home endless notes complaining that he is entirely incapable of paying attention during his lessons. The school administration has strongly suggested that the boy has a biological attention deficit and needs to be placed on heavy stimulant medication. But this doctor, having seen hundreds of children from this neighborhood, knows that surface symptoms often mask much deeper wounds. Instead of immediately writing a prescription, the doctor sits down, looks the mother in the eye, and gently asks when the boy's inability to focus truly began. Slowly, the tragic reality of their lives tumbles out. A few years prior, the family suffered a devastating financial collapse. To survive, they were forced to move into a cramped, shared living space with a deeply unstable, violently unpredictable relative. The young boy never knows what mood will greet him when he walks through his own front door. He does not know if he will be met with silence or with a terrifying eruption of screaming and breaking glass. His home, the one place that should be a sanctuary of peace, has become a minefield. When a child or an adult is subjected to this kind of chronic, unpredictable trauma, their brain undergoes a radical biological shift in priorities. Imagine you are walking home late at night down a narrow, unlit lane, and suddenly, from the shadows, you hear the low, guttural growl of a pack of aggressive, feral street dogs. In that terrifying instant, a massive surge of adrenaline floods your system. Your brain immediately shuts down all non-essential cognitive functions. You completely forget about the argument you had with your boss earlier that day. You forget about what you were planning to cook for dinner, and you certainly lose the ability to ponder the poetry you read last week. Your entire cognitive apparatus narrows into a fierce, singular mission. Scanning the environment for immediate threats and calculating a route for survival, your attention is entirely consumed by danger. Now imagine that you do not just encounter that pack of dogs once, but that you are forced to live in that dark lane permanently. If you are subjected to a constant state of threat, your brain adapts by locking itself into a permanent state of high alert, a psychological condition known as hypervigilance. You become hardwired to constantly look over your shoulder, forever scanning the horizon for the next incoming attack. When you place a hypervigilant child in a classroom and ask him to focus on a mathematics equation, you are asking his brain to do something it currently believes is suicidal. His mind is screaming that if he lowers his guard to focus on the numbers on the chalkboard, he will miss the warning signs of the next violent eruption. He is not suffering from a broken brain. He is suffering from a perfectly functioning brain that is responding exactly as it should to an intolerable, terrifying environment. While the extreme trauma of abuse or violence provides the clearest illustration of this mechanism, the exact same biological alarm bells ring for all of us when we face chronic, unrelenting stress. You do not need to be fleeing a physical predator to enter a state of hypervigilance. If you are trapped in a cycle of precarious employment, constantly terrified that a single unexpected medical bill could plunge your family into total destitution, your brain interprets that financial insecurity as a massive existential threat. If you're isolated, lonely, and devoid of a supportive community, your primeval brain interprets that social exclusion as a danger to your survival. And if you are endlessly scrolling through digital feeds that pump a continuous stream of outrage, political instability, and catastrophic news directly into your retinas, your nervous system becomes convinced that the world is entirely hostile and permanently on fire. We are living in an era defined by a staggering collective surge in anxiety and precariousness. We are demanding that our minds perform the delicate, beautiful acts of deep reading, creative problem-solving, and empathetic listening, while simultaneously subjecting our nervous systems to an environment that screams at us to panic. We flee into the glowing rectangles of our screens seeking a momentary anesthetic, a brief distraction from the crushing weight of our own hypervigilance, only to find that the algorithms are designed to terrify and enrage us further, locking us even deeper into the cycle of stress. We cannot reclaim our ability to focus simply by treating our minds like broken machines that need to be disciplined. We must recognize that our fractured attention is a perfectly natural symptom of a society that has forgotten how to make its people feel secure. To heal our focus, we must first find a way to heal the profound, systemic stress that is keeping us all so desperately afraid. Chapter 7. Reclaiming our pace. Think for a moment about the rhythm of a traditional craft, something ancient and incredibly demanding like the intricate art of hand-block printing. I have a close friend who manages a bustling, highly successful textile workshop right in the heart of our city. If you walk into her courtyard on a blazing summer afternoon, the sensory experience is completely overwhelming. You can smell the damp, earthy scent of wet cotton and the sharp, metallic tang of indigo dye. You can hear the rhythmic, heavy thud of carved wooden blocks striking the long, padded tables. For generations, this work required an absolute, unbroken state of deep focus. An artisan had to align the intricate floral patterns perfectly by eye, matching the edges of the carved wood with the wet dye already pressed into the fabric. If their mind wandered for even a fraction of a second, the pattern would overlap, the colors would bleed, and a long day of strenuous, back-breaking labor would be entirely ruined. But over the last decade, a new, chaotic noise invaded my friend's courtyard. It was the frantic, high-pitched ping of smartphones. The managers were constantly checking messages from international wholesale buyers. The artisans were keeping their phones balanced on the edges of the dye vats to watch videos. And my friend herself was trapped in an endless, suffocating loop of emails, constantly negotiating prices and shipping logistics late into the humid nights. The business was expanding, but the human beings running it were breaking apart. Mistakes began to multiply. Intricate designs were ruined by careless, distracted hands. The managers were exhausted, snapping at each other over minor delays. My friend confessed to me one evening over a cup of heavily spiced tea that she felt as though she was running on a treadmill that was constantly accelerating, and her lungs were burning, but she could not find the button to turn the machine off. The speed of her life had completely eradicated her ability to concentrate on the beauty of the very craft she had dedicated her life to preserving. We are all living on that accelerating treadmill. We have built an economic culture that fundamentally glorifies speed, equating sheer velocity with success and treating any form of pause as a sign of weakness or inefficiency. We expect our emails to be answered within minutes, regardless of whether it is a Tuesday afternoon or a Sunday morning. We expect our workers to be perpetually tethered to their responsibilities, carrying the heavy, invisible burden of their offices in their pockets wherever they go. We have normalized a state of perpetual, low-grade panic, completely forgetting that human beings are organic creatures bound by natural, biological rhythms. We are not servers that can be left running 24 hours a day without degrading. When we attempt to live at the frantic speed of a fiber optic cable, our deeply human, fragile ability to pay attention is the very first thing to snap. But my friend did something incredibly brave, something that most modern business owners would consider financial suicide. She realized that telling her exhausted employees to simply manage their time better or practice personal mindfulness was completely useless, while the structural demands of the workshop remained so crushing. She recognized that the environment itself had to change. So, she called a meeting and announced a radical restructuring of the way they worked. She implemented a strict, non-negotiable right to disconnect. Once the heavy wooden doors of the courtyard were bolted shut at 6 p.m, all work communication was officially banned. No emails, no frantic group messages about tomorrow's dye mixtures, no calls from management. Furthermore, she condensed the work week. She gave her entire staff an extra full day off every single week, without reducing their wages by a single rupee. The initial reaction was sheer terror. The managers were convinced that international clients would flee to competitors who were willing to answer messages at 3 a.m. They were certain that reducing the raw number of hours worked would inevitably lead to a collapse in productivity and profitability. But they committed to the experiment, and what happened over the next few months was nothing short of miraculous. Because the artisans and managers were actually allowed to rest, truly, deeply rest, without the looming dread of a vibrating phone in their pockets, they returned to the courtyard with a renewed, vibrant energy. The chronic exhaustion that had plagued the workshop evaporated, and with that rest came a profound return of focus. The artisans sank back into the deep, beautiful flow states required for their intricate work. The devastating mistakes that had been ruining the fabrics almost completely disappeared. The managers, no longer operating in a fog of sleep deprivation, made smarter, more strategic decisions during their working hours. By structurally reducing the speed and the endless demands of the workplace, my friend did not destroy her business. She saved it. The workshop actually produced a higher volume of top-tier, flawless textiles in fewer hours, entirely because the human minds doing the work were finally given the space they needed to function properly. We do not have to accept the premise that the future must inevitably be faster, louder, and more exhausting than the present. We know it is entirely possible to change our current trajectory, because there are already places that have successfully figured out how to reverse the tremendous surge in speed and exhaustion that dominates modern life. There are entire nations and progressive organizations experimenting with legally protected hours of disconnection and significantly shorter work weeks, actively recognizing that protecting human attention is essential for both human dignity and genuine productivity. They are proving that when we collectively agree to slow down, the world does not end. The tragedy of our current attention crisis is that we are constantly trying to solve a collective, structural problem with isolated, individual solutions. If you are expected to answer messages from your employer late into the night, no amount of personal meditation or digital detoxing on your weekend is going to save your focus. You will remain trapped in a system that is fundamentally incompatible with the biological limits of your own brain. Reclaiming our attention requires a societal shift. It requires us to collectively demand boundaries, to boldly assert that our evenings, our weekends, and our quiet moments of reflection are absolutely sacred and not for sale. Imagine what our cities, our homes, and our minds would feel like if we structurally abandoned the cult of perpetual speed. Imagine waking up in the morning without the immediate, crushing pressure of a dozen urgent demands waiting on a screen beside your bed. Imagine sitting down to do your work, knowing that you have the time and the unbroken space to sink deeply into the task, to find that beautiful state of flow without the fear of constant interruption. Imagine looking your child or your partner in the eye, fully present, completely untethered from the invisible, pulling gravity of a distant office. This is not a utopian fantasy. It is a highly practical, deeply necessary way of living that is already being pioneered by those brave enough to step off the treadmill. If we want to think deeply again, we must first find the courage to slow down. Chapter 8. The physical toll on the brain. Think of a time when you were sitting at your desk, the intense afternoon heat pressing heavily against the window glass, and a thick, almost suffocating mental fog suddenly rolled into your mind. Your eyelids felt like they were made of lead. Your thoughts moved as if suspended in thick syrup. And the very idea of focusing on the complex document in front of you felt like trying to lift a boulder. What did you do in that moment? If you are like most of us, you reached for a quick, desperate fix. You likely grabbed a heavily sweetened iced drink or a packet of highly processed, deep-fried snacks from the corner vendor. For about 20 minutes you felt a sudden, magnificent rush of artificial clarity. Your heart beat faster, your eyes widened, and you felt capable again. But then, as inevitably as the setting sun, the crash arrived. The fatigue returned, significantly heavier and darker than before, leaving you feeling entirely depleted and utterly unable to concentrate. We often treat our inability to focus as a purely psychological failing, a lack of mental discipline, or a weakness of character. We speak about our minds as if they are abstract, ethereal clouds floating above our shoulders, completely disconnected from the physical reality of our bodies. But your brain is a deeply physical organ. It is made of flesh, blood, and delicate tissues, and it operates entirely on the fuel you provide it. When we experience that devastating afternoon brain fog, we are not experiencing a failure of willpower. We are experiencing a violent physical crash in our biological hardware. Over the past few decades, our society has undergone a catastrophic shift in how we fuel our bodies. We have largely abandoned whole, nutritious, slowly digested foods in favor of a diet dominated by ultra-processed, chemically altered, and heavily sweetened products. When you consume these highly refined foods, they break down instantly in your stomach, dumping a massive, unmanageable spike of glucose directly into your bloodstream. Your body panics, releasing a flood of insulin to bring those dangerously high sugar levels back down, which rapidly plunges your energy into a deep deficit. This physical roller coaster of soaring highs and devastating lows manifests directly in your mind. Your attention span becomes just as erratic and unstable as your blood sugar. You cannot sustain a deep, even state of focus when the physical energy supply to your brain is violently surging and collapsing every few hours. Furthermore, this highly processed diet is completely starving our brains of the essential building blocks they require to function. To maintain complex neural pathways and facilitate deep thought, your brain desperately needs specific nutrients, particularly omega fatty acids, which are abundant in fresh, whole foods. By replacing these vital nutrients with synthetic additives and hollow calories, we have created a population that is simultaneously overfed and severely undernourished. We are attempting to run the most sophisticated, delicate cognitive machinery in the known universe on cheap, adulterated fuel, and then we sit back and wonder why the engine is constantly stalling and misfiring. But the physical assault on our attention does not end with what we put on our plates. It extends to the very air we pull into our lungs. Imagine stepping out of your workplace into the chaotic, sprawling rush of the evening commute. The streets are choked with a crawling river of vehicles. The air is thick with the grey haze of exhaust fumes, and the heavy dust of relentless urban construction coats the back of your throat. We have long understood that this kind of severe air pollution is devastating to our lungs and our cardiovascular health. But environmental scientists and neurobiologists have recently uncovered a truth that is far more terrifying. When you breathe in the heavily polluted air of a modern metropolis, you are inhaling microscopic, ultrafine particulate matter. These toxic particles are so incredibly small that they do not stay trapped in your respiratory system. They pass directly through the lining of your lungs, enter your bloodstream, and travel straight up into your skull. Your brain is equipped with a highly sophisticated security system known as the blood-brain barrier, designed to keep toxins out. But these ultrafine particles are small enough to breach those defenses. Once inside, they lodge themselves deeply into your brain tissue, causing widespread physical inflammation. When the brain becomes chronically inflamed, its ability to function degrades rapidly. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal physical damage occurring within the organ we use to think. Rigorous scientific studies have demonstrated that exposure to high levels of air pollution significantly lowers overall intelligence and drastically impairs the capacity for sustained attention, even in otherwise healthy adults. You can meditate, you can turn off your phone notifications, and you can practice the best digital hygiene in the world. But if you are sitting in a room breathing in neurotoxic exhaust, your physical ability to focus will be steadily, systematically dismantled. We must stop viewing our attention crisis purely through the lens of screen time and software design. We are living in physical environments that are actively poisoning our capacity for deep thought. We have built a society where the cheapest, most accessible food physically destabilizes our minds, and the very air we breathe inflames our neural pathways. We are demanding peak cognitive performance from populations whose biological hardware is being degraded day after day. If this physical toll is this devastating on fully formed adult minds, we must pause and consider an even darker reality. We must ask ourselves what this toxic combination of poor fuel, polluted air, and relentless technological distraction is doing to the fragile, developing brains of the most vulnerable people in our society, our children. Chapter 9. The Crisis of Childhood. Imagine the childhood of someone who grew up just a few decades ago. Picture the long golden evenings of a sprawling summer. You would see groups of children running wild through the narrow, winding lanes of the neighborhood, climbing low walls and rushing up narrow staircases to fly paper kites from flat rooftops until the sun finally dipped below the horizon. They were entirely unsupervised, making up the rules to their own games on the fly, negotiating arguments, and exploring the physical boundaries of their world. Now contrast that vibrant, chaotic scene with the reality of a child growing up today. Look at the typical daily schedule of a modern teenager. From the moment they wake up, their entire existence is rigidly structured, monitored, and confined. They are shuttled from heavily guarded school gates straight into cramped private tuition classes and then back into their homes, where they sit under the hum of a ceiling fan, staring into the glowing abyss of a screen. We have, over the last few generations, effectively placed our children under a form of structural house arrest. We have systematically eradicated the concept of free, unsupervised play. We justify this intense confinement by telling ourselves that the outside world has become far too dangerous. But in doing so, we have inadvertently robbed the next generation of a crucial, non-negotiable stage of human cognitive development. We tend to view childhood play as a frivolous luxury, a way for kids to simply burn off excess energy before returning to the serious business of studying. But evolutionary biology tells us a profoundly different story. Unsupervised play is the fundamental mechanism through which a human being learns how to pay attention. Think about what actually happens when a group of children is left completely alone in a courtyard to invent a game from scratch. There are no adults hovering over them to enforce the rules or declare a winner. The children have to figure it out themselves. They have to communicate, problem solve, and compromise. Most importantly, they have to care about the game they are creating. When a child is intrinsically motivated, when they are playing a game because they genuinely want to, not because an adult is forcing them to, they effortlessly develop the capacity for deep, sustained focus. They are building the neural pathways of concentration. But when we dictate every single minute of a child's day, telling them exactly where to stand, what to do, and how to do it, we completely destroy that internal engine of motivation. We teach them that attention is merely something you are forced to give to an authority figure, rather than a beautiful power you cultivate from within. Add to this physical confinement the crushing psychological weight of modern education. Our schooling systems have largely devolved into relentless factories of high-stakes testing. We force young children to carry impossibly heavy backpacks full of textbooks, demanding that they sit perfectly still for hours on end to memorize endless lists of dates, formulas, and facts, purely so they can regurgitate them onto an exam paper at the end of the term. This style of education is deeply hostile to the human mind. It strips away all natural curiosity and replaces it with a suffocating blanket of anxiety. If you force a child to focus purely on avoiding the punishment of a bad grade, their natural, joyful desire to learn and explore the world around them slowly withers and dies. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a vibrant, energetic 8-year-old boy living in this modern reality. You are kept indoors almost all day. You are fed a diet consisting largely of highly processed, sugary snacks that violently spike your blood sugar. You are chronically sleep-deprived because the blue light of your tablet keeps your brain wired late into the night, and then you are placed at a small wooden desk and forced to sit motionless, paying attention to a deeply boring, high-stress task that holds absolutely no intrinsic meaning to you. Naturally, your mind wanders. Your body twitches with unspent energy. You look out the window, desperate for a glimpse of the sky. You fidget. You rebel. How does our society respond to this perfectly logical, entirely biological rebellion? We pathologize it. We call the parents into a quiet office and we tell them that their child's brain is fundamentally broken. We diagnose these children with attention deficits in staggering, unprecedented numbers, treating a global environmental crisis as if it were a sudden, mysterious epidemic of defective neurology. And instead of looking at the toxic, confined, high-stress environment we have forced these children into, our primary solution is to prescribe them powerful, mind-altering chemical stimulants. We administer heavy psychiatric drugs to millions of young children simply to force them to conform to a system that is fundamentally hostile to their basic developmental needs. We are chemically suppressing their distress rather than curing the environment that is causing it. Imagine taking a wild, energetic bird, locking it inside a tiny, barren cage, and then diagnosing the bird with a medical disorder when it frantically beats its wings against the bars. We are not treating a disease, we are medicating the perfectly natural symptoms of captivity. We are failing the next generation on a profound structural level. We have constructed a world that is completely incompatible with human nature, and we are punishing our children for failing to adapt to it. If we truly want to heal the fractured attention of our youth, we cannot simply adjust their medication dosages or install stricter screen time blockers on their devices. We must be brave enough to give them back their childhoods. We must give them back the physical space to roam, the psychological freedom to fail, and the joyful, unsupervised time to play. Chapter 10. The Attention Rebellion. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, parched agricultural field in Rajasthan just weeks before the arrival of the monsoons. The earth is deeply cracked, baked hard by months of relentless, unforgiving heat. If you were to walk out into the center of that desolate field with a single earthen pot of water and pour it onto the ground, the moisture would vanish instantly, swallowed by the immense systemic drought. It would be an act of beautiful, desperate optimism, but it would not save the harvest. To bring life back to that soil, you do not need a single pot of water. You need the sprawling, collective force of the monsoon rains. For far too long, we have been told that to reclaim our fractured focus, we simply need to pour our own tiny cups of water onto the cracked earth of our minds. We have been sold the illusion that a few personal digital detoxes or better time management schedules will somehow cure a profound environmental crisis. But the drought of our attention is systemic, and it requires a systemic storm to reverse it. Throughout our journey, we have uncovered the heavy, invisible forces that have drained the reserves of our deep thinking. We have seen how the chronic exhaustion of our endlessly accelerating work culture, the toxic, polluted air choking our sprawling cities, and the crushing weight of everyday financial stress have stripped away our psychological defenses and locked our nervous systems into a state of terrified hypervigilance. We have unmasked the hidden architecture of the technology in our pockets, recognizing it not as a neutral tool, but as an extractive machine deliberately engineered to frack our attention and sell our deepest psychological vulnerabilities to the highest bidder in a digital bazaar. We have seen how our children are physically confined and chemically medicated, simply for exhibiting the perfectly natural symptoms of captivity. The most liberating truth you can accept today is that your inability to concentrate is not a personal, moral failing. The narrative of individual blame is a brilliant, manipulative lie designed to keep you endlessly managing your own symptoms while the underlying disease runs rampant. You are not weak because you cannot outsmart an algorithm designed by thousands of the world's most brilliant engineers, any more than you are weak because you cannot outrun a speeding locomotive. We are facing a heavily funded, highly coordinated assault on our cognitive liberty, and we cannot fight it by retreating into our own private, heavily guarded psychological bunkers. How do we possibly fight forces this massive and deeply entrenched? We must look to the profound, resonant echoes of our own history. Think of the monumental struggles our ancestors faced. Think of the generations who fought against vast, globe-spanning colonial empires that sought to extract our wealth and govern our destinies. The powers those ordinary people challenged seemed completely invincible. The empires controlled the armies, dictated the economy, and wrote the very laws of the land. It would have been incredibly easy for our ancestors to succumb to pessimism, to believe that nothing could ever change, and to simply accept a life of subordination. Yet ordinary men and women linked arms, marched in the streets, refused to cooperate with unjust systems, and ultimately dismantled empires. Social transformations that once seemed entirely impossible. From the overthrow of colonial rule to the ongoing, fierce battles for women's equality were achieved because people banded together and demanded a different reality. We are now called to form an attention rebellion. This must be a fierce, collective movement to reclaim the very core of our human experience. We must band together to demand the absolute prohibition of surveillance capitalism, insisting that our psychological data can no longer be legally bought, analyzed, and sold to manipulate our behavior. We must demand that our digital spaces be restructured, perhaps as publicly funded utilities or transparent, subscription-based services that are financially incentivized to respect and nourish our focus, rather than fracture it. When the profit motive to distract us is outlawed, the brilliant minds in the technology sector can finally redesign our devices to heal our minds instead of hacking them. But this rebellion must extend far beyond the glass screens in our hands. We must demand structural changes to the relentless, exhausting pace of modern labor, insisting on a legal, fiercely protected right to disconnect when the workday ends so we can finally rest without the looming, stressful shadow of the office. We must demand the restoration of childhood, fighting for safe, open spaces where our youth can play freely, unsupervised and unmedicated, allowing them to naturally build the biological foundations of deep focus. We must advocate for the basic economic security and clean, breathable environments that allow the human nervous system to finally power down its threat detection alarms and return to a state of calm, creative wandering. The fight for our focus is the foundational fight of our time. If we lose our ability to pay attention, we lose our ability to solve every other massive existential crisis looming on our horizon. When we are perpetually distracted, exhausted, and algorithmically enraged, we are small, isolated, and incredibly easy to manipulate. But when we find our flow, when we immerse ourselves deeply in complex narratives, and when we allow our minds to wander safely, we expand. We become capable of breathtaking empathy, profound creativity, and brilliant collective problem-solving. The human mind, when given the space and the peace to function, is the most beautiful, powerful instrument in the known universe. It belongs to you. It is time together to take it back.